My name's Heather Wood. I'm from an ex-mining village on the east coast of Durham, Easington Colliery, and I was in my early 30s in the 1980s. I think I was a very, I fitted in, I think, although I hated fitting in because I've always been different. People have always said, oh, Heather, you different to the others. And I think that was because I was so outspoken, and that's not normal for somebody who comes from the sort of background I'm from. So I just think, I remember, I've always worn trousers, for instance. And I remember my mum saying to us, your dad doesn't like you in trousers, you know. It wasn't my dad couldn't care less, as long as I wasn't wearing a miniskirt. But it was my mother. She thought I should be wearing a skirt and I should be all dressed, you know. But that was the sort of thing that went on. Well, again, it was politics. It's been my life from being very small, you know. My dad worked at the pit, and he didn't get involved in politics, but he talked to us and he taught me a lot. And then my mum was very much involved. So from when I was little, I was out in the streets shouting, vote, vote, vote for Manny Shinwell, who was then our MP, and giving leaflets out with my mother. And then at the age of 11, I was involved in a play about the suffragettes, a pageant about the suffragettes. So it had been there forever, so it's always been my life. So apart from getting married in the early 70s, then having 2 kids, politics has been the other really important thing in my life. I can remember having dire straits shoved down my throat by our oldest son. I think that was the 80s. And now I know almost every word of every song of Dire Straits. But again, musically, it's always been, for me, it's always been rock and roll. It's been folk music. I mean, you just can't beat it, can you? About ourselves, things that are written about us, by us. And it's passing the message on, isn't it, all the way? That's what folk music's doing. And to me, the message is important. So whether we do it by song or by writing or by word of mouth. I remember my niece absolutely going crazy about it. She was disabled and she loved every minute of it. I remember Bob Geldof, and I remember me being so upset about it, because why should we be having to raise funds to keep children alive, to keep people alive, when we live in a very rich world, a world that the Western world could feed all those children. We had butter mountains. You used to, I remember pensioners used to queue up, and you used to have to take your pension book. My mother taking her pension book and queue up to get butter out the European butter mountain, you know. And yet you had all these kids who were starving at the other side of the world, and we were all having to raise money for them. It was fantastic, but I also think there was a political side to it as far as Bob Geldof and them, there was a lot of self-interest, I think. That's my opinion anyway. I remember going into one pub and I started to talk to this man, and it was our Miners' Welfare Hall, and he said to me, no, don't talk politics. Politics doesn't involve me. And I said, what's that pint of beer you've got? He says, what do you mean? I says, well, the taxes. Who gets the taxes off that? The government. That's politics. They decide on what the tax is. Oh, Heather, might have known you'd come up with something like that. But so a lot of people didn't want to talk politics. They wanted to just get on with their lives. This is before the miners' strike. I think just wanted to get on with their lives, unless there was an election coming up. And when you went to the doors, sometimes it was absolutely brilliant. I liked it when it was people who weren't going to vote Labour, because then you got into really good debate on the doorstep. And I've come up against some really good characters out canvassing, doing me politicking, as people would say. Mr. Gleghorn, who was a miner, who didn't find out he was adopted until he went to sign on as a miner at Easington Pit. And he'd been adopted then. There was no official agency to do it. His mother had given him away. She'd signed him away over a first-class stamp. And I just couldn't believe that. And somebody should have recorded his story. I was going to do it, but there's always tomorrow, but it never happens. But he was absolutely fantastic painter, you know. So I met him, just this, his house, his walls were adorned with some beautiful paintings, mainly of mining history. So some wonderful people who were political enough to, but didn't understand they were political enough. He didn't see the politics in his paintings until we had a good discussion. And I think that was the thing, people recognising what was political and what wasn't. And as we know, most things are political. I always say it's like three worlds, right? My dad used to say working down the pit is like a different world. And I went down the pit when I was 11 to have a look. I never went back down. But they had their own language. They looked after each other for their very lives. They relied on a pit pony for their lives because the pit pony could hear what was happening with the coal moving before the human ear could. So you had, that was one world. Then you had above ground, which was the second world where the women and the children were. Now, nobody ever sat down and said to me, Heather, it's terrible working down a pit. It's so scary, it's so dangerous. I just knew it was because I knew my granddad had been killed at the pit. My step-granddad died of pneumoconiosis. My own dad had emphysema. My friend, when I was just in secondary school, her dad was trapped and then brought out dead from Easington Pit, and I will never forget that day. So you knew, and you knew that in 1951 there was a major pit disaster in Easington Colliery. A disaster in which my dad had changed his shifts and the man who asked him to change was killed and my dad was alive. So I was very lucky to have a father. So somehow the women knew and the children knew. And going back to Mr. Gleghorn with the paintings, one of his paintings was of a street in Easington called Tower Street, which was right next to the pit. And at the gate of one of the houses there was the mother of the family and the little boy. And coming up the street was the father coming from his pit. And he had his cap on and his muffler, as we called it, and his bait tin. And the little girl was standing. And she was looking up at him. And I know that little girl was me. And it wasn't, but it was me. And she was looking up at her dad and she was saying, "Me dad's home. He's all right. He's safe." So that was the second world where we all knew that our fathers worked in a dangerous place. But we also knew that our mothers had a hell of a life because, you'll never have seen a pair of pit socks when they came straight from the pit. My dad worked miles out under the North Sea. And when he came from the pit, his clothes were soaking because it was dripping through. But they were also thick with coal dust. So if you stood them for long enough beside the fire, they dried like a piece of marble. They were solid. Could have used them in an exhibition in the Tate Gallery and made a few £1,000s. The third world was, I was going to say the Miners' Gala, but I hate that because that's the posh term for it. It's the big meeting. It's Durham Big Meeting. And that's where all of us, the men, the women, the children, from all the coalfields come together on Big Meeting Day. And we have one hell of a day. We celebrate what we are. So you've got your pit family who are underground, you've got your women and children's family, and then you've got your big family, all of us together. And I don't just mean me dad, me mum, and me and me brother. I mean everybody else's mum and dad and me brother. So we were safe. The only problem being brought up in a pit village is that if you did something wrong, your dad found out at the pit. And when your dad come home, by God, you got a good hiding. So you had to be very, very careful what you did. But it was I think I was lucky because my dad really did pay the price of coal. He worked all the shifts that he could work. And he would work 7 days a week, every week. But then in 1966, as a 14-year-old, I toured Europe with my mum and dad in a car. Okay, we were camping, but we toured Europe. So for a mining family, that was something that was different. It was a big thing then. And I had holidays that a lot of people didn't have. But I paid for it in that I had my dad suffer for a good bit of his life, not being able to breathe. That was the price of coal. So it was cushioned, and it was fun though, because we all knew each other. We had just bought a brand new house. I was very lucky. I married a plumber, and at the time plumbers got well paid. Miners didn't get a lot. But my nana always said I was marrying a rich man. I mean, when I look back, I mean, we had nothing, but I was marrying a rich man. But that was like our third house. And we paid well over the top for it. So it was private. And looking back, I don't know why we were so centred on having our own house. I look at Britain and I look at the rest of Europe, and Britain is obsessed with everybody, or as many people as possible, owning their own property. Those houses were our houses. They belonged to every one of us, and we had no say. She said we voted for her in, so that was good enough. Once they thought they could buy their own house, a bit like I was saying earlier, oh God, that's what we have to reach for. Once we buy our own house, we'll be proper people. So they didn't, a lot of people I don't think realised just once they bought their own house, they had to pay for the maintenance and everything. So what happened was, a lot of people, when you bought them, had to then sell them on, invariably to private owners, private landlords, and those private landlords then let them out to exorbitant rents and don't repair the properties, whatever. But I also thought it was a bit unfair, because I had saved hard and paid through the nose to pay me mortgage. But that's a bit conflicting, because now as a socialist, I don't think I should have bought my house in the first place. I just think there are now less houses for those people. Go out here, how many people do you pass who's living on the streets? And I think all those people would not have had, I didn't know homelessness. I didn't know that when I was younger. I had never seen it until we got the right to buy, until we got people who were leaving the forces who had no property to go to. Those houses were our houses, the same as British coal was ours, electricity was ours, water was ours, and they sold it off without asking us. But people thought, oh, it's wonderful. We're going to own shares in this, and we're going to buy our own house. And then they found out that to sell the house, couldn't afford it. They had to sell the shares at probably less than what, or they lost out when the banks fell. So they lost a lot of money. When she sold off our houses, and I look at people in my village who need accommodation, who are now living in old mining houses, old colliery houses, owned by private landlords who don't even live in the country, who couldn't care less about it. They don't even know where it is. They don't repair them. They charge exorbitant rents. So yeah, if they're unemployed, the council pay the rent, but they have to pay the difference. So imagine, out of your dole money, or whatever it's called now, you have to pay the top up for your rent before you can buy your food. Otherwise you haven't got a roof over your head. That's why we've got as many people on the streets. It wasn't the land of milk and honey that Thatcher and her cohorts had said. I trained as a nurse, but I didn't like having to live in Sunderland. How stupid. I mean, it's only about 9 miles away, but you had to live in the nurse's home, and you had to be in by a certain time at night. Otherwise, you had to climb a big wall and get into your bed and leave your pillows in your bed, so that when the matron came round with her torch, she thought you were in bed. So that just wasn't for me. So I took off home, and I ended off, there was no phones or anything, so the matron had to get the police out because she didn't know I was at home. From there, I went to work at Janet Fraser's. It was a catalogue firm in Sunderland. I was a clerical assistant, and at that time the warehouse downstairs had a union, but upstairs we weren't unionised, and the management were telling us we had to work 7 days a week. We had no choice. So Heather being Heather, I think I was about 17 then, I went downstairs to see the people in the warehouse and said, can you help us organise a strike? And, because I think we should have a union. So I did organise a strike. We had a big meeting outside Janet Fraser's at Sunderland, and I'm pleased to say we formed a union, and we were given the option as to whether we worked weekends or not. So that was the first inkling of direct action from me. And then I decided I didn't want to work when I got married. Like my nana said, I married a rich man. I didn't need to work. So I didn't need to go out to work. I was a housewife, so I didn't get paid. I had 2 children. I looked after them, and the eldest was 11 before I went to work. But I can tell you now, we were like ships in the night, because I was out doing my politicking. So when John came in from work, I would be going back out. I'd say, there's the kids, feed them, bath them, and put them to bed. That's your pleasure, you being out plumbing all day. So that was the way, and I think that's why we get on now, nearly 50 years later, because we just learn about each other now, because we never saw each other earlier. But in those 11 years, I got more and more and more involved in politics. And it became every ounce of me being. I just wanted to be out there, yes, for my kids, but also for everybody else's kids. And the more unfairness I saw, the more I wanted to do it. And so I was a member of the Labour Party from being about 17. And then I became chair of the constituency party, which was just prior to the miners' strike. And we tried to educate the public on what was going to happen, because we could say what Thatcher was going to do. And we had, at that time, the biggest gathering of miners' banners outside of Durham that there'd ever been. As the strike got nearer, you could see we need to be organised. And I said to the men, to the rest of the committee, I think we need to be organising women, because if we don't organise the women, the strike won't last. You see, in our area, and this story goes maybe worldwide, that in mining areas the men rule the roost. Well, it's never been true, right? Men have always thought they rule the roost, but they haven't. We just let them think that they rule it. And God love them, we guide them along the road. All the things that are coming out about the strike are coming out to men, because they're coming from the union. So it's the men that are reading it. We need something to go to women. So we agreed that we would send a letter to every woman in East Durham, and because we didn't know which house was a miner's house and which wasn't, and nobody had their information, the union either. So we got together, put a letter to women, delivered it, and we organised a meeting in Eastern District Council offices, and hundreds of women came. We set up support groups that consisted of a lot of women who'd never been involved in politics, never really been interested, to women who became very involved, to women who picketed, went on rallies, wrote books, performed in plays. I think the amazing thing for me was just how big things grew. And I didn't realise they were growing so big. And it's only, I was talking to somebody just last week, and I said, it's only this last year that I've realised just how big things grew and how much we did. But I remember that I thought was important that we didn't go and ask the Miners' Union permission for what we were doing, that we went and said, this is what we're doing, we just don't want you to clash, you know. So the first meeting we went to was where we set up the first support group, which was in Easington Colliery, and me and Denise Gregory went to the miners' meeting, but we couldn't go in the meeting because there'd never been any women in the meeting. So we had to sit outside while they debated whether we could go in or not. And it was just so absolutely, I just couldn't believe it. I'm a very visual person, so if you can visualise a committee room like a boardroom with a boardroom table, you looking through the door and the boardroom table is straight ahead of you, and it's all filled with men. And then you look around the walls and all the pictures on the wall are men, except the Queen. And you are going into this like, God, where am I going here? And Alan Cummins, who was the Union Secretary, was sat at the head of the table. And I remember lifting my foot, and I exaggerated it. I lifted my foot right up. And I said, are you sure? Because once this foot comes over that threshold, it's not going back, mind. And he laughed. But he laughed because he didn't realise just what we were going to do. At first, the women didn't want to go on picket lines. When I was talking politics, they didn't want to talk politics. Oh, we need to make the dinners. That's all we want to do. But bit by bit by bit, it was like, did you see McGregor on the telly? Did you see Thatcher? What do you think about Scargill? They started there and they wanted to do more and more, so they went on rallies all over the country. And then, and I'm just talking about Easington now, but I'll expand on the others just now. But we used to meet on a Thursday in the Colliery Club, the Workmen's Club. And as it went into the strike and people got less and less money, the women on our committee were starting to, like, the tempers were getting frayed and everything. And there was a lot of arguing going on. And I said, I remember this night, I said, look, you go home and you think about what you want to say in this meeting. If you've got a gripe, write it down, whether it's a song or a poem, a story, and then you bring it here on a Thursday night and you say it, and we'll have one humdinger of an argument. But when you go out through those doors, we are one. The strike is bigger than us. And they did it. They brought the poems and the songs and the stories, and we had hell on a Thursday night. But after that, we were best mates. I remember saying to our local vicar, do you know, I'm a Christian, I shouldn't hate anybody, but I absolutely hate Margaret Thatcher. And he said, Heather, special dispensation. You can hate Margaret Thatcher as much as you like. So it was lovely. I could go home and say, I hate her, I hate her, I hate her. It wasn't about coal. As much as we didn't have clean coal, and we know the environment is absolutely under threat. This world is under threat. But we could have got clean coal. There was stuff around, and there still is, so that we can clean coal. But Thatcher wanted to get the biggest, strongest union, and that was the NUM. And she did it. She said we were making it political. And as much as I think Arthur Scargill was a chauvinist pig, he was right. Everything he said was right. Thatcher was out to shut all the pits and to rid this land of the NUM, the National Union of Mine Workers. She's a capitalist, and she doesn't believe in helping ordinary people. She thinks, and I think they truly believe it, that's what's sad. There's part of us thinks they truly believe it, the other bit isn't fooled by that. But I think they believe what they're saying, that, you know, we can all aspire, and if we all work hard enough, you can have your house, you can have your business, you can have a big bank account, you can have shares in everything. And if you don't, it's your own fault. That's capitalism. And Margaret Thatcher epitomised that. In the process, she just wanted to kill that union so that the rest was easy peasy. And to me, men during the strike were saying, oh, see what a woman does, see what a woman does. I said, she's not a woman. She's playing politics the way a man plays politics, purely with the head. You have to play politics, yes, with the head, but you have to have a bit of heart. But she thought she would be bigger and she would be stronger if she played it the way the men had. I've been in politics. I've seen a lot of women change. I used to say that if she came to the door, I would slam the door in her face. But then I realised, no, I wouldn't. I would grab her and bring her in so that I could listen to her and so that she could listen to me. Not that it would have made any difference to her, and not that it would have made any difference to me, because she would never indoctrinate me. She was a pure bastard. She wasn't a woman. And as the strike went on, it became more and more clear what she was trying to do. There was a lot of miners who commit suicide. There's a lot of miners whose marriages were ruined, who were then estranged from the children, who then had mental health problems, and who then had drink problems, who then had drug problems, you know, and there was a lot of young girls who had teenage pregnancies, who I know it would not have happened. And there's nobody can convince me that all that crap could have happened if the pit had been opened, because we looked after each other. It wouldn't have happened. We would never have had drugs in my community, because the men would have gone down and they would have gotten those who were providing the drugs. We wouldn't have needed the police, because we policed ourselves. But Thatcher did that. What the government were going on about, and what the press were going on about, is that we didn't have a national ballot. But at that time, it was quite within the rule book. For each, Cottonwood was the first pit that came out. Then, say, I don't know which order it was in after that, but say Easington Miners' Lodge met. They had the big meeting of all the members and said, do you want to come and support them? Hands up. Right, we vote strike. And it went pit by pit. The government tried to pull us down and they used the ballot, and it was misused. It was wrong. It was a sidetrack. McGregor, I mean, have you heard the only bit I remember about that song? Uncle Mac, the memories keep flooding back. The day my father used to go to work to pit each day. It seems to me there's irony that up there at the NCB seems to be an Uncle Mac in charge of all the pits. And that was and it goes on and on about whatever. I mean, fancy putting a bag over his head to try and disguise who he was. That's how frightened of us he was. I mean, Jesus Christ. We had the might of the state against us. We had all of them against us. But we still stood tall. Maybe waited till it was winter to have a strike. When there was low coal stocks. But what had happened was there was big coal stocks. But you see, we thought we could still beat them. And again, I have to say, I think we did in a way. Okay, the pits are not open, and some people would say, oh, you lost. But I still stand tall, I'm still proud. So ballot doesn't make any difference. They always say nationalised industries don't work, but they don't work because they don't put somebody who works in them in charge of them. They bring somebody who hasn't got a bloody clue from across the ocean in to say how you run a pit. He'd never worked in a pit, he hadn't a clue. All he was brought in to do was close them. Easington Pit, at the time it was closed, was a profitable pit. It had just had thousands, and I mean thousands of pounds worth of new machinery taken underground, which was later just left. And the country lost a lot of money because of Thatcher. Margaret Thatcher, that's where I remember the most out of the 80s. She said, there is no such thing as society. And I'm afraid she created the no such thing as society. It's coming back now, but she created it. She said, look after your own and bugger everybody else. That's what capitalism is. It's starting to come back, and I thank God for that. And I think the 80s was, I always say 84, 85 was happy, it was sad, it was good, it was bad. I went on to be on the council after that, the county council, which was all old men. Oh, Jesus, I was the youngest and I was a woman, so I was like crap. So there was a fight there. So there's all those fights going on in my mind, but I fought, and that's the important thing. Never give up. No parazien.